Hi, Dr. B here with a rather extended nuts and bolts piece comparing worker placement, committed intent, and action points in games, primarily tabletop games. So first we have to define these three. Worker placement has at least three versions. In each version you place a token to indicate what task or move or play you're going to execute. In the what I think is the original version, exclusive worker placement, when you place a worker at a task, that blocks anyone else from placing there. In another version, as players place at a location later than the first, they gain lesser benefits or capabilities. And in another version, everyone gets the same benefits no matter when they place, whether they're first or last at that location. The committed intent is rather different. I don't know another name for it. It's not a very commonly used name. Each player has the same selection of cards, usually 9 or 10. Some of those cards will be duplicate actions, though each will have a different initiative number from 1 through 9 or 1 through 10. Players place a card face down. All the cards are revealed simultaneously, and then they're executed in initiative order. The numbers on the cards, with tiebreakers. And tiebreakers may be who has the most points or who has the fewest points, something like that. The cards usually stay on the table for the rest of the round, so once you use a card, you can't use it again in the round. In the extreme version of this, players commit several cards at once. They place them all face down in a set order. In any case, it's a step towards simultaneous play, and among other things, it eliminates first mover, last mover problems, because it all depends on what initiative is of the card you play. Action points are somewhat different. Each task that you want to do in a turn costs 1 or more action points. So moving a piece might cost 2 action points, building something might cost 1 action point, but you still have to fulfill other conditions, and so forth. Each player has a limited number of action points, usually the same number for each player, and those cannot be saved up for next turn, generally. The distribution of the action points depends on the symmetricality or lack of same of the game as a whole. If, for example, if you have a World War II game, you might give the Axis more action points to reflect how they took the initiative in the war, and then as time goes on, the Allies can gain more action points till they get as many as the Axis or even more. Action points are turn-based, though conceivably players could alternate spending action points until all were expended. You might notice all of these methods, I haven't said it, but all these methods generally are used for games for more than 2 players. Now, all of these forms are constraints on the players, and after all, a game is a set of constraints that people agree to follow. Though players are less and less happy with constraints nowadays than in the past. All of these forms help avoid analysis paralysis insofar as the method limits what a player can do, although less so in action points than any other methods. None of them are like an old-fashioned war game where you can move 40 or 50 or even more units in your turn. That's the kind of thing that can really promote analysis paralysis. Now, I have to confess that I have never used worker placement in a game design. The exclusive kind rarely reflects any kind of reality, whereas I make models of something. I don't string together bunches of mechanics. The worst kind of game imaginable to me, bar completely random game, is mechanics salad, or mechanism salad more properly, where a bunch of mechanics are thrown together and you have a game. Also, there are so many worker placement games that have little to differentiate one from another. Why would I bother? I do use committed intent and action points when it works and is appropriate. Now, let's consider worker placement versus committed intent. Committed intent selection is simultaneous. Worker placement is generally turn-based. Committed intent usually leaves cards on the table, limiting future choices. It can also be used to require players to commit to several choices ahead of time. Worker placement renews all the choices each turn. Committed intent is initially hidden. Worker placement is visible to all. Committed intent determines the order of execution. Worker placement can, but usually doesn't. Committed intent requires a deck of cards, which adds to the expense of the game, but on the other hand, the cards can contain helpful rules summaries. Worker placement versus action points. While action points allow a greater variety of moves or choices, worker placement is usually very simple. Using action points requires more thought and consequently more chance for analysis paralysis. Exclusive worker placement can block other players. Action points don't block in and of themselves. The actions of the players could block something. Action points versus committed intent. Action points don't limit what you can do according to what you did in the previous turns of the round. In committed intent, you have those cards staying on the table. And by the way, when those cards stay on the table, they're face up where other players can see what you've done, so they know, oh, he can't do that particular thing anymore because he's already done it. Action points allow a greater variety of choices. Action points, on the other hand, can be subject to movement order advantage. Committed intent is simultaneous. Committed intent can require planning ahead in a way action points cannot. It can allow for surprise in a simultaneous choice. It requires a deck of cards, which adds to the expense, but again, the cards can contain helpful rules summaries. Now, I much dislike exclusive worker placement because the mechanism itself can interfere with what someone is trying to do. Committed intent and action points themselves don't interfere. Now, the resulting player actions in the game might, of course. I want the actions of the players to make a difference, not the mechanisms of choice. Now, that's a fine distinction, but that's how I look at it. Also, I think worker placement is generally too simple for modeling reality, even a fictional reality. And again, exclusive worker placement has virtually no analog in the real world. Now, there are two related sequencing methods that could be seen as variations of these other ones. In role assumption, each player takes a role, which is often represented by a card that enables the player to do certain tasks, and frequently there's only one of each role available. Bruno Faiduti's Citadels, if I recall correctly, uses this method. It's more or less exclusive worker placement. In another version, in their turn, a player plays a card representing an action. Other players can do the same action, but with lesser benefit. Something like, but not the same as, the second type of worker placement. Now, I think you should use whatever mechanisms work in the game, and if it's a model, then some are going to be better than others for certain situations. What I suggest you do not do when explaining your game to someone is start by saying it's a worker placement game, or it's an action point game, or it's a committed intent game. Mechanisms are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. You want to describe what people do in the game, not how they do it. That also is a fine distinction. But when you just say, oh, it's a worker placement game, you're putting yourself in a ghetto, a big ghetto, but it's still a ghetto. And that's not something you want to do. You want to give a description to somebody that makes your game sound, if not unique, at least unusual. And one that's about what actually happens in the game, not what mechanics are being used or mechanisms. Thanks for listening.